everyone, and welcome to Emotional Grit, the podcast where you can learn about the power of perspective and the science that fuels us. My name is Jennifer Fernjack, and I'm your host. Today's guest is Laura Sorenson. She'll be talking to us about how things such as dancing, music, and nostalgia can all affect people physically. So, with that being said, thank you for joining us, and please feel free to like and subscribe on the YouTube channel for this podcast, which is called Emotional Grit as well. So, Laura, let's get started. So, thank you for being here today.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm excited to talk about this stuff with you.
Great. So, I understand that you have a dance class for elders, and so I'm wondering where it is and how it got started.
Yeah, I am very lucky to volunteer teach 2 classes a week at Episcopal Homes, which is an elder community in St. Paul, although they have locations in other places as well. And the way it came about is that, oh gosh, I guess about 8, 9 years ago, I was attempting to make full-time work out of being a dance teacher, which is a little challenging because it's gig work, right? You stitch together multiple classes to try and get something close to full-time work. And in one of those classes, I had a participant who was in her 80s, but very, very active. And this was a class that was not at Episcopal Homes. This was a different class I was teaching. But she grabbed me after class and said, I think you need to come do this at Episcopal Homes. I think you'd be a great fit there. I think your energy could bring a lot to a class there. I was like, oh, that's very nice of you. I appreciate that. But didn't necessarily think anything would happen with it. She at her community went and talked to the creative activities director and brought her to my class that I was teaching at the time. And Kristen, who was the activities director, still is, just really clicked with what the class was about, what we were doing, and said, I really think that if you did some small modifications or just changed the approach, even just slightly, it could be a really good fit for folks in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. The class that she had participated in was mostly people in their 40s through their 60s. And so she and I started talking about things. And I started teaching that class at Episcopal Homes, I believe it was in 2015. So that's how
Okay.
it came about.
Well, and it's also my understanding that the actual core group has included people over the years from either assisted living or independent living or memory care units, that kind of all across the board as far as who you've reached and how it's just helped people. So the stories are just nothing short of amazing. So I'm excited to talk about them today. So I also understand that as far as the choreography that you've created, that it helps people with what are called DLAs, or is it daily living activities, I believe?
Daily living activities, yes.
Yes. And what are some examples of just the types of choreography that you design and how do they help people?
Yeah, there are 2 really easy to picture examples. One of them is the act of pulling on a pair of socks. Sort of involves 2 pieces of your body primarily. You're going to extend your leg and then lift it so that you can put the sock over your foot. And then, of course, you pull back with your elbows. And so currently we have that exact movement where your foot is lifted and you're pulling back with your elbows at the same time as part of a song that we're doing by Bobby Darin. Bobby Darin's very popular with the class participants. And so that's one of them. That also involves the coordination of multiple types of movement. The shorthand that we often use in classes, it's one of these, right? So that also has some cognitive benefits. So as you are developing and keeping developed the muscles and the movements that help you pull on a sock, you're also getting some of the cognitive benefits there. Another one, and we do this to an Aretha Franklin song that probably everybody knows, Chain of Fools, very popular in class, where we reach and pull. And you can do this up high, or of course, I always offer modifications to users so they can do it lower, but it helps work the tricep, which means that if you are reaching up for a mug on a shelf and then bringing it down, or if you're removing a plug from an outlet, it's the exact same kind of movement that we do in the chorus of Chain of Fools. So we are working on things that if you were doing them in the context of exercise might be pretty boring, but you put some music to it, you put some other movements before and after it, and suddenly you're dancing. So that's kind of what
So
we're trying to do with the daily living activity stuff.
now Bobby Darin, he was popular, was it the 1950s or 60s? I'm
I
trying to
think
remember.
50s and 60s.
Okay.
And that is definitely a very popular era for the participants for a variety of reasons that I bet we're going to talk about some today. But yeah, a lot of 50s and 60s, a lot of big band, a lot of Sinatra, that era of things.
Well, and I also saw that you include music from Motown and jazz artists and just
Mm.
music that has relevancy to the people who are dancing, which is a very valid point because, first of all, some people's favorite music is somebody else's noise. You know what I mean? So it's like you want to have that music be relevant to the people so it has some meaning. And there's also a
Mhm.
term that psychologists call salient stimulus. And basically, it means that the stimulus, in this case, the music, actually is relevant to the actual resident who's dancing. So whether it reminds them of their first kiss or their first car or when they got married or whatever those positive memories are, that kind of music is going to resonate with them more and have that effect as far as like lowering their stress hormones and actually increasing the feel good chemicals of the brain. So pretty cool stuff. And I also
Yeah.
understand. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
I think there's possibility that it goes even a little bit deeper and maybe more primal than that. Of course, the idea of hearing a song that reminds you of a happy time or a happy experience is a wonderful thing. But there seems to also be some research that's emerging that supports something that I think we've kind of known anecdotally, which is that every generation, probably every person, really feels very strongly about the music that they knew in their youth, especially in their teens and 20s. I think this comes up when you hear stereotypes of people of any generation saying, oh, that kid's music these days, that's just noise. My generation had really great music. And there seems to be some research that indicates this is because the music that we hear in our teens and 20s really imprints on us in a way. And we come to experience that music as empirically, objectively better than music of other time periods. There is a pop critic and historian named Chris Melaniphy who talks about this pretty consistently. That the music we hear in our teens and 20s just really resonates with us for the rest of our lives. And so, yes, if there is a song that reminds you of your first day of college and you had a great first day of college, there is a connection to a specific memory, but there might also be this deeper, more broad thing of music from that time in my life is always going to be something that I love. And so that's something that I try to really keep in mind when selecting music for the class.
which brings up an interesting point. It makes me wonder when people my age all of a sudden get into whether it's assisted living or even memory care for that matter, is that music then going to be hair bands and hip hop? I think back to when I was in high school, from Def Leppard and Bon Jovi to Run DMC and Salt and Pepper, so it's just funny. And then when I was in college, it was all going to be grunge and things like, it's Pearl Jam and then Nirvana. So I'm picturing people my age and older when they're in the elder care kind of scenarios, dancing to a little Snoop Dogg or something. So it's
Yes,
just,
yes. I have to imagine that at some point in assisted livings all across the country, we'll all be rocking out to Motown Philly.
oh,
Uh,
for
you know,
sure.
the classic 90s hip hop and R&B, or the
Yes.
80s. I mean, I love new wave. That was a little before I was a teenager, but I heard that in my youth, and to this day I love it. So I'm sure that Duran Duran and the Cars are going to be something that I really want to listen to,
That's so
at
funny.
any age. Mhm.
That's awesome. Well, and I also think back to a number of years ago when I saw Paul McCartney in concert at the Target Field. And when he sang Hey Jude, there were people all around me with their cell phones in the air going like this, which back actually as a kind of a side note, back in the day, that used to be cigarette lighters at concerts.
Yeah.
They were going like this,
Yeah.
but now it's cell phones. But as people did that to Hey Jude, I could see by the light of the stage just tears coming down people's faces because part of it was nostalgia. And nostalgia also applies to just things in everyday life as well. I know that on Mother's Day, I use my great grandma's china, and that has meaning for my grandma because those are her mom's dishes. And with nostalgia, there's also the power of a sense of belonging because you were a part
Yes.
of that era. I mean, she used those dishes when she was growing up. So nostalgia can also affect people physically. And I don't think people realize that. People will sometimes wonder, well, what's the big deal if they're just dishes? No, it is a big deal to my grandma because they were her moms. And those
Yes.
feelings of nostalgia also come into play with music too. So pretty
Yes.
interesting,
Yes.
interesting stuff. But
I think that also plays out in the class in a couple of ways. In addition to enjoying the music of your youth and having the memories, you just used a really interesting word, which is belonging. And even though this class, it's a dance class, but people aren't doing high kicks and stuff, right? Like it's pretty accessible movements, but no matter what, dance is a very vulnerable activity, right? That you are sharing part of yourself that is being driven potentially by a lot of emotion. You're doing it in a group, which is very powerful, but also, of course, there are going to be some people who feel vulnerable in that act. And if they can feel a sense of belonging, either because they're part of their own community while they're doing this, or because there is a song that helps put them at ease with familiarity, and they feel like, oh, yes, this is where I'm supposed to be, I think it gives them a lot more freedom to engage more fully with the dancing because they don't feel as self conscious, they don't feel as vulnerable. They can show up and lean into the joy of it without feeling like they have to be reserved because of how they're being perceived. That sense of belonging frees them to take potentially emotional risks that they might not otherwise.
I could see that. But again, it makes me wonder if when people my age are going to be in these scenarios, taking these kinds of classes, are people going to try to moonwalk? I think that it's like Michael Jackson was just the coolest thing, when we were
Yes,
little. And with his
yes,
garden glove he would wear, the
that's
novelty of his
right.
glove or whatever, and again, novelty can affect people physically as well. So it's just crazy how, again, things in everyday life can have an imprint on how you experience things and how you view things and how much enjoyment you can get out of them,
Mhm.
But so I read as part of the information you provided me ahead of time that how you had mentioned there are studies out there that show that if people take group classes, that can somehow have an imprint on pain perception and how it lasts longer as far as trying to suppress those feelings. Could you describe that a little bit for the listeners?
Yes, absolutely. So, my understanding of the way that this study was conducted is that similar size and age groups of people were divided into two groups, which, of course, if you're going to do a study, it's good to have a control group, right? So, the people in the control group listened to the same music and were asked to dance or move along to the music, but they did so independently, extemporaneously, the way you would dance if you go to a party or a club. The other group was asked to do unison dancing. They were given movements to do ahead of time. So you can maybe picture something more along the lines of line dancing, where everyone is doing the same kind of movement. So you're really doing it in community in a deeper way than the group over here, which was together and listening to the same music, but they were moving independently. And prior to the activity, the participants were asked about their perception of pain. And then directly after the activity, they were asked again, and then several hours after. And right after the activity, my understanding is that the perception of pain improved greatly for both groups. But then when you looked further out, 3 and 4 hours later, the group that did the same movements, more like a line dance, coordinated movements that they were all doing together, continued to have lower perception of pain than the group of individuals who were moving independently from each other.
Fascinating. I mean, this is just amazing, and it's just, and at least nowadays, we're aware of neurochemicals and we're aware of how different things in everyday life, again, whether it's dancing or music or nostalgia or things like that, can all lower stress hormones and then, of course, influence those feel good chemicals. But a long time ago, especially before people had access to the internet, people just didn't know why certain things help them feel good or take the edge off their experience.
That's right.
I know that my mom worked as a nurse, excuse me, in a nursing home up in Duluth, Minnesota, which is of course up by the shores of Lake Superior, where it's cold a good chunk of the year, and then it's dark a good chunk of the winter. I would say the sun can set as early as maybe like 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the winter, depending on daylight savings. So imagine being in my mom's position as a caregiver in a memory care unit where she had people who had what's called sundowners. And basically, sundowners is a form of dementia where people would feel more agitated when the sun would go down. They just were very kind of removed and didn't really want to talk to people. And even something such as a rug on the floor could make them very agitated and scared because their depth perception was affected. They couldn't tell if the rug was like a hole or what. But my mom had talked about how the nurses from the day crew would say, "Wow, Mrs. So and so, she is so nice," meaning a resident is super nice.
Yeah.
And then the night crew is thinking, "No, she's not." Well, again,
Yeah.
it's people didn't understand the idea of sundowners and just what was going on. So one of the issues they had as caregivers is that these nurses, including my mom, had a hard time getting people to eat their food and also to take their prescribed medications. And I don't know if my mom acted on a hunch or if someone tipped her off or what, but she then brought a tape recorder with her to work. Now, this would have been back in the 1980s. So again, no World Wide Web, no
Right.
iTunes, I mean, nothing like that, just her tapes. And she would bring tapes to work, again, of like Frank Sinatra or big band era stuff that you mentioned earlier. And when she would play that for the residents, all of a sudden their whole demeanor would just become more relaxed.
Hmm.
And they were more apt to eat their food and take their prescribed medications. So she literally could tell a difference just in their eyes. All of a sudden, they would have the spark back in their eyes, like they were happy. And sometimes she would see them tapping their feet, or she would see them drumming their fingers on the table, that kind of thing, like they were
Hmm.
trying to keep up with the music. But again, it was just interesting how back then people were being affected by music, but people just didn't know why.
Yeah.
So pretty cool
Yeah.
stuff. But
Yeah.
now, do you have people? Have you experienced people in your class who have had dementia? And I'm wondering what kind of an
Yeah.
effect you've seen the music have on them.
Yeah, I have. And one of the things that's a little unfortunate is post-COVID, there are more separations between the different areas of the community. Of course, right? If you're living in a group setting, you've got to be pretty careful about COVID precautions, right? So we don't currently have memory care residents participating in the class, but right up until COVID, we did quite a few. And of course, I'm with them for the time of my class and a little bit after. I don't necessarily get to see how things benefit them in the hours afterward or in the evenings necessarily, but this is something I've definitely seen in my class. And it sort of falls into two different categories with the memory care folks. And one is mood, and the other is engagement. And in the mood category, I definitely would see residents from the memory care unit be brought into class. And, you can tell by somebody's facial expression most of the time whether they want to be where they are. And sometimes these folks, upon arrival, really didn't want to be there. Or maybe they just felt neutral about it. Okay, I'm here. This is a thing, very neutral expression. But you get a few songs into the class and they start to realize, I'm going to go back to that word of belonging that you use. This music is making them feel like they belong here. And you can see the mood improve. And sometimes it would be sort of gradually over the course of class. Sometimes you just hit that one song that really has specific meaning or resonance for people, and they will break out in a smile immediately. So there was definitely results in terms of people's mood who were participating. The other one I think of more as engagement, where some of the participants would be brought in a wheelchair to the class. They're there, but they're maybe not really engaged in the present moment, right? They maybe are not making eye contact. They're not necessarily looking around. They're seated, but they seem like their focus is internal, potentially, rather than external. And again, whether it's the accumulation of the songs over the course of class or you hit that one song that has special meaning to them, suddenly you will see engagement. And that can look like eye contact, that can look like sitting up very straight, where before they had maybe been hunched over. But also, you would see people who look like they really weren't necessarily even aware of their surroundings start singing along with a specific song. And I get chills thinking about it. That was one of those things that just, it's unmistakable. I
Wow.
I don't know how anybody could fail to see the difference of someone who comes in who seems like they don't want to be there, who's not making contact, and suddenly they are, for lack of a better word, like very awake and singing along, and they're breaking out into a smile. it was such a gift and did me so much good and continues to do me so much good to see those types of things in my class.
Oh, another good point, because the fact that when you have people, again, whether they're in independent living or assisted living or perhaps memory care scenarios, the music obviously and the dancing can then help them as far as how they feel and how engaging they are. But as a caregiver, whether it's someone who's teaching a class and wanting what's best for them, or perhaps someone who's working at a nursing home or one of these assisted living facilities or what have you, I can imagine that their jobs sometimes are a bit challenging. And so I'd be able to have that kind of engagement with people and connect with them is a true gift. And on top of that, people with dementia, the brain's an interesting thing because it's going to go back to what it remembers from a long time ago as opposed to what it remembers
Mhm.
or should remember from today. So I
Yes.
know a friend of mine worked at a nursing home, and there was someone there who had her cognitively, and she had been impaired, whether it was dementia or something to that effect. And so every day she would ask one of the nursing assistants to weigh her because she still thought it was the 1960s and she was a flight attendant. And back when she was a flight attendant, she had to be weighed in to go to work every day.
Yes.
So every day then those nursing assistants would say, "Hey, you're great. You haven't gained any weight. You're perfectly fine. You can go to work and have fun on your trip." And they knew just to play into it. Now, had they
Yeah.
taken the opposite approach of shaming her and saying, "You're not a flight
Yeah.
attendant," and then getting her flustered, that's not going to do anybody any good.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, I recently met someone whose father-in-law passed away from dementia. But before he did, he only went back to speaking Norwegian. And he had lived in the US for decades, but he forgot how to speak English. I mean, his mind went back to speaking Norwegian because that's where he was from, was Norway. So
Yes.
fascinating stuff. But I do want to read a couple excerpts from my book because they tie in nicely to our discussion, where I
Yeah.
wrote here about music and how it can affect people with dementia and people with Parkinson's disease as well.
Mhm. Mhm.
So the first thing that I want to call out here reads as follows. Music can improve mood, reduce agitation, stimulate cognitive abilities, and help facilitate motor functions. So, again, as far as that reduction of agitation and what have you, that makes me think about the people who have the dementia who are now going to be more engaging. But as
Mhm.
far as Parkinson's disease goes, and for the listeners who aren't that familiar with Parkinson's disease is one where people are more apt to shake. And as far as how much they shake depends on the person and what their circumstances, but whether it's their hands or their feet or their legs or what have you, it's the shaking. So what I wrote here about that as it relates to music is for Parkinson's disease, playing or listening to music can foster improvements in motor skills, hence the dancing, cognitive abilities, and sensory functions by increasing the brain's production of dopamine and serotonin. That's why there are stories of people with Parkinson's disease who can dance yet have a hard time walking. So I'm wondering what your experience has been with Parkinson's
Mhm.
disease as it relates to your class.
Yes. So one thing that you and I've talked about a little bit briefly is that because of HIPAA regulations, I'm not necessarily aware of each participant's diagnosis unless they
Yes.
choose to share that information with me. But one of
Yes.
my longtime participants did share that about herself, that she was living with Parkinson's disease pretty much right up front when she started coming to class. And she came to class for years because she wanted me to be aware of what was going on with her. And I'm always grateful when somebody's willing to share that because it does help me understand what's going on. And she was in a wheelchair, and really what was noticeable with her shaking, it was in her hands. And not only would I notice that over the course of a 45-minute class, I would see her hands shake less. She would specifically articulate that to me after class. Where possible, I would always spend a little time with folks after class and just kind of go around and go, "Hey, how'd it go for you? You did this part really well today," or "You look like you were really feeling this particular song." Just check in with individuals to the extent that I can. And she would always, or frequently rather, say, "I don't know if you noticed, I'm shaking a little bit less after class. It's one of the reasons I come here." So she was self-aware enough. Um, Actually, she was very self-aware about many, many things. I really miss having her around. Uh,
Wow.
to know that about herself, to share it with me, and of course, that I think gave us both the incentive to keep doing what we were doing. It made her want to keep coming to class. It made we want to keep doing the class. And so, yeah, I was really grateful to her for being willing to share that. Not only that she was dealing with Parkinson's, but also confirming what I myself was seeing, that
Oh
she
yeah.
would her hands would shake less after class. Yeah, so that absolutely, what you described really aligns with what I've seen.
Wow. So, is there anything that we haven't touched base on today that you want to call out, or perhaps provide more details on things we have discussed?
Oh, I'd love to share a couple of thoughts that I had about your chapter on the benefits to the person who is providing the care or the kindness. Uh, you know, you talk a lot about the feel good chemicals in the brain and how beneficial it is to be someone who's a helper. I absolutely feel and have noticed all of that. Uh, but I feel like there's also another level of that that happens if you're doing something that is long term versus just occasional. And if you're doing something that allows you to give back in a way that aligns with something you're already passionate about, right? So, as someone who's been doing this now since 2015, it has really changed the way that I feel about myself. And the way I think about it is in terms of meaning and identity. I think my mom, when I've talked to her about this, has been one of the folks who first said, I can tell how much meaning this brings to your life. And I don't know that there's a better way to articulate it. This activity does bring more meaning to my life. But even more than that, maybe not more than that, but related, is that I feel like this is part of my identity now. And I'm a pretty type A person. I am very driven in school. I always like had to get the good grades. And that comes often a lot with a side order of anxiety and being hard on yourself. And learning to be gentle on yourself is something that probably all humans can stand to work on. But by having part of my identity be tied up in this kind of activity where I'm doing something kind for people, it helps me think about myself differently. This is not something just that I do. This is something that is who I am. And if you are have a tendency to be hard on yourself, boy, looking at yourself as not just someone who does this activity, but someone who this is part of your identity, it really does invite you to be gentle and to give yourself credit for doing this. And it helps me walk through the world in a different way because I feel like this is something that is who I am. To the extent that I get to do this, that I'm lucky enough to do this, where I can give back with something that I'm passionate about, right? Dance and music. Obviously, there's a lot of help that we need to deliver to people, to animals, to the world that is not necessarily aligned with our passions, right? If you're helping your neighbor take out their garbage, that's a great thing to do, and they need help taking out their garbage. I don't know that any of us are that passionate about taking the garbage out. I am lucky to have found an opportunity to give back that resonates with my passion. And the way that I experience that is, at least what it feels like to me, is that the benefits of doing it, because it aligns with my passion for dance and music, means that the benefits I get are greater. They feel greater because I'm aligning my passion with giving back in a way that's long term. And I have a hunch that that has uh, meant a lot more benefit to myself than it would be if I was doing something occasionally that was helpful, but maybe wasn't long term and maybe didn't necessarily align with stuff I was already passionate about. That has
Well, and
been
I can
a
relate
huge
as
gift.
far as, my brain tumor surgery was back in 2016. And within probably maybe 5 months, 5 or 6 months of the surgery, I began my speeches. I've given
Yeah.
speeches now for people around the country. I've also obviously written my book that I quoted from today, and now I'm doing my podcast. So there's a saying in the public speaking world that where you can give pain a purpose, it's almost as though you can kind of justify or get your head around what it is that's happening to you or has happened to you. So for me,
Yes.
I control the fact that I had surgery for a meningioma tumor? No. Can I control the fact that I got radiation treatments for it, even though I didn't have cancer, with the hopes of just killing the remaining cells? No. But the thing about it is that by experiencing those things, now when I talk to people, it's more relatable because I've experienced the things myself. And it helps me get my head around more just kind of what I've
Yes.
experienced, as I alluded to, because I've seen so many positive things have come out of it. So a lot to be said for
Yes.
that too.
Yes.
But
You found the meaning in it, right? It
yes.
doesn't change the fact that bad things happened, but you've been able to, as you said, give that pain a purpose, and
Yep.
that provides meaning not only for yourself but for the people who hear you speak. I mean, the way that you and I met was I was lucky enough to have an opportunity to hear you speak and came up to you afterwards and said, "Oh, this music stuff really resonates for me." Um, Proof that the things that you're speaking about and the way that you took what happened to you and made meaning out of it has an impact on the people that hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And also thank you for being here today.
It's
And
my pleasure.
thank you. And also thanks to all of you for listening and watching the podcast. As I alluded to earlier, the podcast can be found on my YouTube channel, which is called Emotional Grit as well. So please feel free to like and subscribe. Thanks, everyone.